a reported 6,500, but certainly thousands of migrant workers, which hangs over this World Cup. Miguel Delaney of the London Independent is with us. Evening, Miguel.
Good evening.
At the point of this piece, it just struck me, I was... this sounds like a boast. I was in the gym this morning. That's not the point. But I was jogging away, and I was, all the TVs on silent, and it just came up on Sky Sports News on one of the TVs. We're 11 days out from the World Cup, and they were focusing on the Mane injury. Yeah. And I just thought, what a weirdly weird space football is in, that here we are. It just hit me, 11 days out from a World Cup. And there is no hype, there is no build up. Now, in part, I think it's because the club action is continuing right until the eve, so there's no vacuum. But then it's more than that, and be it Gary Neville and Have I Got News For You dominating over the last couple of days, or the Qatari World Cup ambassador referring to homosexuality as a damage in the mind on German TV, or Sepp Blatter, Qatar is a mistake, it's all Platini's fault. There is just an incredibly odd atmosphere here on the eve of this World Cup.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, if you want to talk about a weird space, well, look at what this tournament has normalised. I mean, because for all this noise and all this criticism, ultimately we're going into a situation, I'm going over on Friday week, where we're going into a World Cup in a country where it is normal for hundreds of thousands of migrant workers to be lured to the country under false pretenses, or to have to pay some sort of kind of agency fee or recruitment fee that puts them in debt, and then be in a situation where they all, to all intents and purposes, given they can't change job, given the difficulty of moving, given how indebted they are, where they're in a slavery situation. It is absolutely remarkable. It should be a non-starter for a tournament. And there are times when I kind of think about it when all this comes up, and I kind of reflect on that. And how is this happening in 2022? It's absolutely insane. I was on a call today, a briefing from one of the human rights groups, where one of the representatives was from Human Rights Watch, was saying, like, this absolutely cannot happen again. It's ridiculous that FIFA never had any sort of human rights provision in their World Cup plans to prevent this. And yeah, but then of course, here, what's the latest coming down the track for 2030? Who are Infantino's next big allies? Well, Saudi Arabia going to pitch for it, which would be all the same issues again, but multiplied by 100 more.
It is like something so grim that you feel this belongs to another era, that this couldn't happen somehow in the present day. And I remember, like, we first started seeing these reports, for instance, of the migrant workers and the conditions and the deaths in certainly 2014, and we talked about it in the show, and The Guardian went in and there were videos, and it's just so staggering that even in the last 8 years, even overnight when that first emerged in 14, that even if it was just for pragmatic, cynical PR purposes, that FIFA didn't march straight in and say, this needs to be sorted out right away, overnight, better conditions, no more debts, better pay, like, just sort it out because we can't take the heat. Even if it was as cynical as that, it's actually staggering that this was first reported all those years ago and it just continued. On the eve of it, there is a fatigue out there with this stuff, but it's just hard, as you said, to get your head around it.
Well, I suppose if you want an indication of the sort of state, I mean, there are many indications. Like, at the moment, I'm working on a piece basically trying to kind of lay out, just put it down all on paper almost, everything wrong with this World Cup. And the breadth of issues, from obviously migrant workers to the motivation behind it, to the way it was won, then even kind of stories that don't come out, like how what the UN would describe as the discrimination as regards race, even among migrant workers themselves. But again, if you want an indication of the sort of state we're talking about here, so some people within Qatar and some well-meaning people within the Qatar who would want reform would argue that there are, I mean, because one of the biggest things with Qatar is they have, you always see so many headlines that they're making progress or that things have started to change, like kafala has been abolished, and federations like the FA would point to this, or FIFA would point to this. But this is actually a repeated pattern with Qatar, where you have the big headline about change. 6 months to 18 months down the line, the human rights groups investigate what's actually changed. Nothing has changed in practice. That's happened with almost everything as regards this tournament. And now, so as I was saying, people within Qatar would argue that there is there's a huge cultural infrastructure that has to be turned over here, that has to be reformed, which is really a decade-long, 12-year-long job. But of course, they've had the tournament for 12 years now, and we're still in the same situation, really, in practice, that we were in 2010. Because, I mean, and this is another point that really shouldn't be overlooked, but Qatar, given what it's sitting on, given the amount of money it invests into Western infrastructure, in order essentially to make it more difficult to criticise them, to deepen all these links. Given all that money spent, given the money they've given David Beckham, they do actually have the resources to actually have a proper labour system in the country. But they haven't spent any money on that. Instead, they've spent money on PR, public relations, trying to fight this. It's absolutely, and that's something that's been very notable in the last 6 months as well. I think really since the draw, and the first change I noted this was with Gareth Southgate, when he had a very mild comment, and one of the Qatari officials completely attacked him, and that's escalated in the last 6 months, where it's gone from Qatar almost, or people around this World Cup, almost accepting criticism, thinking, oh, we'll do better, to now being really belligerent about it, with that translating, as you said, in some of these kind of disgraceful comments about the LGBT community in German media from one of the Qatari officials. It's a real belligerence right now. They're really snapping back. And we're in a situation where FIFA's big defence of this term, or football's big defence as well, and you hear it with kind of the sports washing clubs as well, where, this can help affect change. Now, to a degree, it actually might have been true in Qatar, because especially if there was two simple things brought in, and we've discussed it on the show before. They start investigating worker deaths, and that's another. I mean, Qatar always get really angry when this figure comes up of 6,500, or the one in Germany today, 15,000. Now, they've got no right to get angry, because yes, media can't actually say what those figures are, but that's only because Qatar refuses to investigate migrant worker deaths. It's absolutely scandalous. And so investigation, or the beginning of that process, would be one remedy that would actually start to improve things in Qatar. Another would be compensation to workers' families. But there hasn't been enough pressure. Football has mostly been, with some exceptions, some very brave exceptions, it's mostly been quite mute on this. It just wants to get on with it. Now, I would take the point, to be fair, that if you're a player, ultimately, like the World Cup is a career ambition. Yeah. And imagine and I think I've said this before myself as well, imagine Italia 90 happened to be Qatar 90, how different we'd feel about it, our big historic occasion. And from that perspective as well, it's a little bit unfair to put a huge burden on players for decisions taken well above their head. But equally, if they're going to this World Cup, so you have to go with your eyes open and realise what it is. And from that perspective, I think the game has been weak on it. I mean, like these rainbow armbands or whatever. I remember I was talking to someone about that, about when there was a big discussion over what the European game was going to do next as regards some sort of protest against Qatar. And the words were literally put to me by one official, oh, it won't be T-shirts. Well, it was less than a T-shirt. Literally, it was an armband. And I think that, to be fair, there was quite a good statement on Sunday from the UEFA working group where they did actually press for compensation. But let's see if that actually happens. But even Qatar itself has been belligerent about the idea of compensation. And yes, there's so much swirling around it. And this, I was thinking about this last night, actually, when I was doing some research on, because obviously at the moment, as a journalist, we're in this kind of double-sided situation where you have to cover what this World Cup is, but you also have to cover the football. It is a historic event in that context as well. And I think the football always has to be put into the political context here. But I was thinking to myself, and you kind of referenced it there at the top, talking about 11 days out. Like I was watching one of the 1982 games, and you start to get a little bit that little bit of magic kind of comes back. And then I immediately found myself feeling guilty about it because this isn't the proper World Cup. And I think it's obviously the least of this World Cup's negatives or its problems. But it's also quite a sad thing that I think one of the great joys of life. There's always that line I once read about how people measure their lives in World Cups. Yeah. That's it. And this is kind of just taken away from it.
Yeah, it's an amazing atmosphere. Again, because it just struck me with 11 days out, this should be peak.
Yeah.
Who's in squads? We've all seen the Brazilian players receiving the good news, and those videos go viral, and you're starting to read the previews, and, there's been a little gap in football, so everyone's anticipating it. If anything, I think at the moment it's even becoming a touch more acrimonious as things like Have I Got News for You and mainstream media outlets who maybe, you know, were vaguely aware of this thing going on, but suddenly they're turning their attention to it because it's the story of the day and almost going with fresh horror. Hang on, what's been happening here?
Yeah. That's exactly, and that's the thing. It's only, I mean, for all the 12-year build-up and all the reports, it was something I think that's sort of bubbling away in the background until actually the reality presents itself, and then everyone's confronted with it, and then of course all the actual the stories and the many horrors behind this World Cup become all the more acute as well.
It's funny, I mean, in terms of how to talk about it or not, like we're doing an in-house chat just with the team on air yesterday, and we were talking about the Gary Neville situation or whatever, but it's interesting. One of the comments on YouTube was, can you stop going on about this? If you're that against it, just boycott it. And the answer to that is very simple. If you don't go on about what's happened here, then you will just get the PR version from FIFA. So we will go on about it every single day here because it's so abhorrent. And if we don't go on about it, then what's the alternative? There's nothing to see here. So, you know, I understand the fatigue out there, but I think we have just been desensitized to the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, because we get this a lot, and I particularly get it on social media from fans of certain clubs. But I mean, one of my first thoughts on that, because again, no matter what way you dress this up, no matter what perspective you're coming on, it is a fact that this is an event of historic significance. Obviously, it's the World Cup. It's an event of huge sporting significance, and its cultural value means that has an historic value as well. But the political dimension adds to that as well. This is arguably the biggest, the biggest sporting political event in history, or certainly, I would say, since the 1936 Olympics. Now, can you imagine if the only record on the ground of the 1936 Olympics was by propagandists, people who weren't going to go there with any sort of journalistic or critical mindset? And that's why the media has to cover it, I would say, because as you say, otherwise a public relations image is allowed to spread. But equally on that as well, I mean, and this is one thing Qatar kind of knows as well. With a World Cup, no matter where, you've got a captive audience. This is going to be shown all over the world. It's going to be on every television in the world. Most people, even if they have reservations, will end up watching it. And so from that perspective, that means the idea of a boycott or protest, it's sort of a non-starter, because then it just means this is out there. So you've got to actually, and since it's out there, you've got to put it in its correct context and cover what actually happens on the ground in Qatar around, and I suppose relay the reality. And yeah, as you say, Joe, put everything in context. But I mean, the one thing on that as well, in terms of what we're going to see on the ground, I mean, as journalists there, I mean, you won't be able to get near Labour camps. There's already been some sort of...
Why not, Miguel?
There was a memo that went around Qatari companies to essentially send a lot of workers back for the duration of the World Cup, because obviously they want an image. It's almost like the kind of, again, another political World Cup, 1978, where like the shanty towns are all covered. There's an element of that. But I think one of the biggest issues in terms of on the ground, and again, this is actually why reporting it is important. I think a little bit like Russia in 2018, protest groups who wouldn't usually have the chance will use the eye of the world and the fact Qatar has to be maybe a little bit more forgiving, or at least that'll be the perception, because the eyes of the world are on it. They'll use that for protests, inside grounds, outside grounds. I think there'll be a lot of that. And what's going to be really interesting and instructive, and this has a significance way beyond the tournament, is how Qatar actually polices this, how they respond. I think that's just one example of why it's important to actually report the reality, especially when because you always get to think about the classic with these tournaments, or with FIFA, UEFA broadcast. Anytime there's any sort of protests, they immediately flick it away. They turn the cameras away. I remember that at the 2010 World Cup final, which was the first I went to, that Jimmy Jump guy ran onto the pitch. That wasn't on television, and so I really don't expect any protests to be on television in that way. Certainly not if we're coming from the live broadcast. And there's another element there, which is how, even though FIFA would defend itself saying it's going to use this World Cup as a positive legacy, that it should be separate from Qatar in that sense, and use all the weight of the game to put pressure on Qatar. There has been a sense, and that could be seen with the letter sent by FIFA last week that was leaked by Rob Harris, or reported by Rob Harris, I should say, that kind of FIFA and Qatar are intertwined on this.
Yeah.
Especially as regards communication, which again points to the importance of actually being there and being able to look around.
So what's so frustrating about this debacle in so many ways is, of the 6,000 plus deaths, there's nothing that can be done, even though this issue has been pointed to in 2014 and right through. It's in the past, and it's shocking. With regard to how this tournament will be policed, and you referenced that point. For instance, James Cleverly was criticised the Foreign Secretary when he talked about how members of, well, I don't know if he specifically talked about the LGBT community, but he urged fans to be respectful of the culture of the host nation. Do we know, or do we have any sense, what would happen if a same-sex couple are walking down the streets of Doha holding hands across this World Cup?
So we had a Foreign Office briefing in Whitehall last Tuesday, and this question obviously came up, and they basically couldn't tell us. That's one for the Qataris. We would just stress to people to observe the culture. Now, to be fair, that warning extended to heterosexual couples as well.
Okay.
To be mindful of their their cultural traits. But the very fact that, I mean, also on that, we got a similar answer basically when we asked, well, a lot of us are journalists, obviously. We've covered Qatar in quite a critical sense, and we have to download this app, the Haya app, which, I mean, there's been a lot of reports about how much access it can actually have to your phone if you have to download it. Couldn't give us an answer on that either. So, right. But actually, there's another point there. I mean, this isn't related to that Foreign Office briefing, but I'm speaking more generally on, I suppose, Cleverly's point. Usually at this point in a World Cup cycle, and it's happened before, I mean, there was an element in 2018, obviously an element in 1978, usually MPs would be falling over themselves to kind of gain the political, I mean, obviously some actually genuinely care, but also there will be an element of political cachet to criticise aspects of the Qatari World Cup or problematic tournaments like that. It's been very little this time. And again, we come back to that point. How much has Qatar invested into so many Western economies? 4 billion into Spain. They own 20% of Sainsbury's. And it's something we talked about on the show before. Buying football clubs is all part of the same thing, where it's these states who, again, we come back to the point at the top about how this kind of, what is effectively slavery, has been normalized. I mean, if you put the facts of some of these states in front of anyone's face, no matter who they are, even if they're kind of the most, invested Newcastle fan, people will be horrified. When it's actually presented in your face, people are obviously turned off because most people are decent people. But through all this investment in Western infrastructure, through this integration, it means they can gain the value of these connections without making any tangible changes to what are problematic political structures. And again, there's often a response in this, well, we're just as bad in the West. Well, the West obviously has problems. The UK, where I'm living, has no problem of its own. But it's not really comparable to these autocracies. I mean, it's not comparable to, what is a surveillance state, no free press, and so many issues beyond that, where like the basic liberties we have in a problematic Western Europe are just not accessible in Qatar.
An impossible question. I might play this clip back to you when you get home. What are you anticipating you'll feel about the whole experience, or what do you think we'll say about this World Cup when it's wrapped up from this vantage point?
That's an interesting, because actually I'm working on another piece at the moment on political World Cups, and there's really, I suppose, every World Cup obviously has a political dimension.
Yeah.
But obviously the most overtly political were 34, which is Mussolini's Italy, 78. The juntas are Argentina, and 2018, which has become even more problematic. And in hindsight now, it has been called basically a modern 1936. So I was even speaking to some of the 1978 Argentine team and how they feel about their victory, and there's quite a lot of differing opinions among that squad about that. I mean, my view is it's ultimately it's a solid World Cup. That's its legacy.
Yeah.
And whether that affects how you feel if you win it, well, I suppose the French players, their medals aren't solid from 2018, are they? They're still their World Cup medals. But from a wider context, it's difficult not to feel that
this can't be regardless of how the next month goes. It can never be regarded as a successful World Cup. I mean,
no, absolutely. Yeah.
Cast has been dyed. Die's been cast rather. So, okay, when are you heading out?
I'm going on Friday week. So actually, which would have been 3 days, but of course they moved the first game. So I'm going to that Qatar against Ecuador. And actually, there's a lot of it's interesting with the Qatari national team as well. There's a great book that people should read, which is Inside Qatar by John McManus, which is a great chapter on the Qatari team and how obviously there's so many nationalized players, sorry, I should say, in their squad. And obviously they're not in the same situation as migrant workers, but in terms of their status in the country, some of it is reflective in some of the issues that the migrant workers have faced, where they even though they were so successful in 2019 Asian Cup, there's been this big discussion and debate over their full citizenship. And again, at every turn you can't really escape. And then of course, what's England's group? Iran, USA. It's remarkable, and that's another element of it that we haven't even touched on.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. I know you're busy doing various things. We appreciate it. Miguel Delaney of the London Independent. Thanks, Miguel.
Cheers, Joe.
Cheers. Our football coverage on Off the Ball is brought to you by Sky. All the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
Football